Hey everybody, this is Josh Halpern. I'm back. We're going to talk about legal considerations for exporting. This video will save you time and money. Not a lot, but if you consider $150 to let's say $650 an hour for a lawyer, you do the math as to how long this video is and therefore how much money it's going to save you. So again, it's not going to stop you from hiring a lawyer. You should definitely do so per your needs, but it will reduce the amount of time perhaps that you spend with such a lawyer. And talking about lawyers, we're going to talk to Diana Clark Esposito, an import-export lawyer, about the legal considerations when marketing overseas, especially online, liabilities in terms of whom are you selling to, and where and how can you mitigate the risks at your point of checkout. Also, how do you navigate the waters of free trade zones? And we'll talk about currency repatriation and how to handle taxes and duties when products are returning or passing through your free trade zone location. So let's check it out with Diana Clark Esposito. Diana Clark Esposito coming to us from New York. All the legal knowledge packed in here, coming to us here in the van. Thanks for joining us. Could you talk a little bit about who you are, how you came to be the lawyer that you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. Essentially as an international trade attorney, when I was in college, I had the good fortune of having a friend from high school invite me to go study abroad with her. I'd never actually thought about going, anywhere out of the country. And what ultimately happened was we ended up doing some traveling down from Sweden to Spain ultimately, and it just totally opened my eyes to a lot of things. So what I found myself doing after that is finding other opportunities. I ended up doing a master's in the Mediterranean as well, prior to going to law school down at Tulane Law School, where I also had the opportunity to spend about 8 months in Barcelona. Continuing that into my professional career was something I was really interested in doing. And, and really, there's so few international trade attorneys. I was very lucky to even find a role in this area.
Can you break down this Clark Esposito for us here?
Absolutely. Sure. So I, was born Diana Clark, and then I married an Italian man. So actually, he's from Naples, and they actually pronounce it Esposito. But
Esposito. Wow. But where's the origins of Clark then?
Yeah. So straight out of Louisiana, and it turns out there's a lot of Clarks in western Louisiana from an area known as Natchitoches.
What is the number one argument you and your Italian husband might have?
This won't be a surprise, but it normally will involve food. Yes.
Sure. Now, because why? I mean, what is it that he's looking for in his food intake?
Well, he's looking for only meals that are Italian, and specifically Southern Italian. So red sauce, not white sauce. We do it this way. No, this is the portion. No, it's red wine, and the wine we want from Puglia or Campania or Sicilia, So I'm from California, so, give me a little Napa Sonoma. I like other things.
So there's an issue that obviously, probably can't be solved through legal means. So we'll leave that aside and obviously come back to check in with you in a few months. But we do want to talk about some of the legal issues, so let's dive in. We've got a bunch of questions for you.
Okay. Let's do it.
What part of international law do you mainly focus on?
Here at the Clark Esposito Law Firm, my law firm, we help streamline the global business operations of importers and exporters. And so anyone buying a product from overseas and bringing it here into the United States, or a U.S. seller who wants to expand their sales and go overseas, we help them with whatever an issue might be. So whether it's related to a government, if you need a license, if there is a shipping issue. Same with inbound in relation to if there's a U.S. customs issues, maybe your cargo's been detained, or maybe you want a better rate of duty, the taxes you pay for anything coming inbound. We help with these sorts of issues.
Could you give us some examples of some issues that your clients come to you for?
Absolutely. So let's start with the export side. We'll have clients come to us. They may want to reach into a new market, but they want to evaluate the business opportunity. And part of the business opportunity has to do with just what are their laws in relation to that country's imports as well. And later on, I'll share a story about sort of your worst nightmare and how to avoid that. But you always want to take a good look at the import and what that other country's import and export regulations are.
Let's go right into that. What is this story you speak of?
So, to give you an example, I know of a company who had been interested in selling goods across the continent of Africa. And part of what they were doing in terms of sales was that they were also offering to replace or repair any portion that had been broken, right? So you buy a warranty, like maybe you have a warranty for the computer you're using right now. And so you can head over to whatever retailer and get it fixed. Maybe you can get it fixed in 4 hours or 24 hours, however. And so the company was sending inventory of replacement parts to Nigeria. And what ended up happening was they said, you know what, let's actually bring everything back to our home country. And what ended up happening is, and they didn't know this in advance of sending all of this inventory, but what ended up happening was they had $1.2 million worth of inventory in a country where any item imported is prohibited from being exported. So they could no longer get their cargo, these replacement parts back to where they wanted to have them. They had to then find secondary sellers, or junk it and see what they could get in terms of scrap, etc. So it was a big loss for them.
And so, from a legal perspective, what do you do, or from that standpoint?
What we would recommend, although most exporters don't generally do this, is to do some due diligence in advance. Find out, okay, we'd like to sell here, here's an opportunity. Which, if you're looking at a continent, which is the best country to then bring our goods into? Which, especially if you have a prohibition on anything exported. And you remember, here in the United States, we are not allowed to bribe government officials, which for other parts of the world is business as usual. But we can't actually slip anybody some money just to get something out of the country, for example. Certainly, if you're caught doing that, there's our Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Now, we don't deal very much with that, but of course we work with clients to ensure that there is no funny business in transactions which may be occurring.
No funny business. The thing that we find, companies, I get the idea that we're supposed to look at which countries are better for certain scenarios. It's very macro, and usually a lot of the entrepreneurial kind of mentality is, well, I got this down and I'm going to do it differently. How does this pertain specifically to me? And it's hard to get that granular and make a decision. You kind of just think, well, I got a buyer in Nigeria, or I've got a scenario in Nigeria or somewhere else. I'm going to do it. So is there anything detailed that you can do to look at a buyer's background?
Oh, absolutely. And, I fully appreciate the smaller e-commerce seller. In fact, we talk to them all the time because they want to expand their exports. So, how do we go about doing that? But there's several considerations to consider. And we've got different articles on our blog. If folks are interested in reading up on it or reach out to me, I'm happy to have my office send you some articles.
We'll put them all here in the notes. So.
Okay, yeah, because there's issues in relation to who you can even conduct business with, and when you're looking at selling abroad or even importing, this is considered a privilege by our government. It's not considered a right. So if you want to engage in these activities, even if you're a small player, even if it's your very first shipment, you still have a duty to be responsible, or you can end up in some serious trouble. So you want to bear in mind there are certain countries we cannot engage in certain transactions with, such as North Korea, right? We basically can't do anything with North Korea. That shouldn't be a surprise if you're exporting in any case. We have companies or financial institutions that we're not able to conduct transactions with. So maybe the party we're selling to wants to pay us from a certain bank, but if that bank is actually prohibited from engaging in a financial transaction with somebody in the United States, or if you're not somebody in the United States and you're thinking, oh, I can send it to another country and still get the money, that's also something that cannot be done. And then there's also individuals, and there's also certain activities. The Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, OFAC.gov, they do have resources where you can conduct a search. And they have something called the Consolidated Screening List, and you can go ahead and put in the name of the entity. You may want to try a few variations to see if the individual or the company comes up, or even the financial institution. But this is a free resource that's available for exporters to try and do things the right way and understand where you may run into a problem. If the government can see, and so you want to keep a record of this, save a PDF printout, print it out of your attempt to have done a search, because they do look at your attempt to do the right thing as a factor. It's called a mitigating factor in the event any penalties might be issued. If you can say, hey, I tried to do the right thing, they take that into account.
So a mitigating factor is the idea that you've intended to and tried to figure out if you're selling to somebody whom you shouldn't be selling to. And that alone is valuable, whether or not it's a complete satisfying of the law. It certainly is valuable in that process.
Yes, and certainly, listen, anytime we're looking at, unless it's, really egregious, but if it's a first time, if it's a mistake, if a client comes to us, it's like if it can be done and we evaluate it as such, we say, listen, let's see if they'll cancel, this penalty based on XYZ. And so a mitigating factor could be an XYZ, and your attempt at due diligence could be X, for example.
Great. And for a lot of the e-commerce companies, just so you know, those people watching at home, in your checkout counter and when you're doing an international plugin, a lot of them, you can block off certain countries. That helps from a macro perspective, but I presume if somebody comes in from France and says, I'd like to purchase an item, you obviously are allowed to sell to somebody from France, but what if they're buying it for somebody from Iran? You don't know that, and that's, I presume, okay. There's no way for you to know that, but what if they put the address in? That would trigger, you should know that. You shouldn't be allowing delivery to certain countries. Obviously, I don't think you can sell vegan enriched uranium soap to someone in Iran and ship it anyway, but is there something there that we should know about?
No, absolutely. And it's not even about sort of a heavily licensed item like uranium. Essentially, nothing can be sold to, somebody in Iran. We have super limited things that can occur. So if there's humanitarian assistance, the agency has what's called general licenses. And so they make certain exceptions for certain types of goods to be sent to countries like Iran that we basically can't do anything with. They then have what's called a special license, which you need to go and write to them and ask them for a special license, laying out what exactly the transaction is, what the financial institutions will be in terms of payments, who the end users are. And I want to touch on this idea of an end user and the end use, because the way that the government is evaluating what you can and can't do also turns on what the use may be. And this is not only with the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, but it's also in relation to the BIS out of the Department of Commerce, the Bureau of Industry and Security. And, with something that's heading to France, and then thereafter goes on to Iran. Here's what you can do as an e-commerce seller. Because again, it's about how have you protected yourself. In your checkout, because you have the description and then you've got a checkout. And there, I think anyway, on some of the platforms, there's a box for additional notes, right? Where you can ask them to provide additional notes. If there is a purchaser and they do want to send it to another country, you can ask that question on your checkout page or put a statement in there, and ask, is this going to another country? And ask them, to insert that country. If yes, insert name of country. And this, because what that is called, what you described, where it goes to one country and it's bound for another country, is called a re-export. And re-exports are also governed under U.S. law. And so the U.S. government is interested in where is the final destination. I'll give you an example. So I know of a company who is engaged in shipping, and specifically for e-commerce sellers, okay? And, and understand whenever there's a problem, the issue, it goes down the line through everybody involved in the transaction. So you as the seller will also be impacted by this. But here's what happened. They had, the seller had a purchaser of a sweater, for example, okay, was wearing apparel. so under, maybe $100 or less. And it was heading to the Ukraine. And, for the most part, not a problem sending a sweater to the Ukraine. Except there was this contested area known as Crimea. And it just so happens that the United States has sanctions and nothing may be actually sent into Crimea, okay? And so if you've got something and you're sending it to France and it's bound for the Ukraine, and you're unaware of Crimea's existence, for that matter, and you don't know that there's a problem, here's the scenario. If you have a FedEx, for example, FedEx will tell you, you know what, we can't actually take it all the way there. You're going to have a problem. And they'll let you know that in advance. It's based on the postal code. However, if you're using a company that isn't FedEx, it then arrives in France. In France, it gets transferred over to a Russian company, okay? And the Russian company, who, by the way, the problem we have with Crimea is that Russia had invaded it, claiming it was theirs. And for this reason, we dispute whose territory it belongs to. But under Russia's view, it belongs to them. And so a Russian freight forwarder has no problem whatsoever delivering to something they consider their own country anyway. And the problem is that's a huge problem for the United States because of our sanctions, which prohibit activity with the Crimea region of the Ukraine. So, it may seem like more than you want to do because it is more than you want to do. But it is something you do need to do to be asking the questions to make sure you know enough about your transaction.
Thank you, Deanna. So again, it's not just that the country is called Crimea, it's that it's a crime. It's actually very historic and interesting, and I couldn't help myself because the word crime is in Crimea. But not all countries have that in their name, so you have to really be careful. The other issue I was going to ask you about, the checkout. If you have an option for a consumer to opt into to give information about where it may be going on to, if it's another country, a lot of us are very sensitive about having any friction in that checkout process. If you don't make that obligatory, but you have it as an option, that would be a mitigating factor where you tried to get it, but you didn't stop the process if they didn't fill it out. Because most 90% or more of consumers are not obviously sending it to another country or another destination. So you don't want to stop that for everybody.
Absolutely not. But understand, I don't think most foreign customers, especially if they're making a smaller purchase, through e-commerce with a U.S. seller, is even aware of the Office of Foreign Assets Control or BIS, or that there's an issue. So, as the seller, if you have the option, you can say, is this going to another country? If yes, state the country. If no, state none. And I can appreciate the no friction at checkout. However, where there is no crime afoot or what have you, and most people, like I said, are oblivious to there even being government restrictions with other countries, I would not think that additional step would be of such significance where it could really impact the sale if the seller really wanted to buy it.
Thank you, Deanna. Okay, let's transition to digital marketing, the do's and don'ts. What are some of the ways that a business can head up in a little bit of hot water from your perspective?
One thing that our government does not like are deceptive or what they consider unfair business practices. So if you're making false advertising claims or something that could be deceptive, whether you're stating something specifically or failing to say something, so if you're omitting something. And these rules are, on the whole, they're governed by our U.S. Federal Trade Commission. Then couple that with other things, if you take like a vapor or tobacco product, for example, now you also have another agency with oversight of your marketing claims, and that would be the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So depending on what your product is, you want to understand who's paying attention to you in what way. But for all intents and purposes, the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, they're governing anything that may be sold. And they're particularly looking, so when they're looking, at deceptive claims, let's start with the basic premise. They have something that they generally refer to as qualified claims and unqualified claims. And they use this to evaluate a statement made. That's what they refer to as a claim. So an unqualified claim could be where we say made in USA. A qualified claim could be where you say it's made in USA of imported parts. So they want, essentially the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And when it comes to statements about, built in the United States or made in the USA, they're very sensitive to the USA as a mark, if you will, as its own label, because of the value in saying, "Hey, this product is made in the USA." And it's so protected that the standard that they use is what's known as the all or virtually all standard. And so if not everything you're using is all or virtually all originating from the United States, then you cannot use that statement. It needs to be qualified, so whether of imported parts. Now, I've seen a lot of small sellers, and now larger ones, but really small sellers like to talk about how something was handcrafted in Brooklyn, for example, which is also a popular place to have things coming out of, or designed in San
Designed in,
Jose.
I've heard. Handcrafted,
Yeah.
though, if it's not made there, how can you say it's handcrafted?
Right. So in the mind of the manufacturer, they're taking the inputs and they are combining them in such a way that it results in this finished product. The way that the government looks at it, however, is, okay, well, but where did those inputs come from? And so if you want to qualify the handcrafted in the USA, maybe your parts of whatever you're building are from Argentina. So you'll want to say, of parts from Argentina, or of components, or whatever the thing may be, to round out that statement.
If you're exporting a product, especially to an individual consumer, you're packing it up, you're sending it, I would assume that the importing country, or the country where the product's being imported to, is the one that's really making sure that their consumers are protected with the right information. But you're saying that at what point in the process is somebody going to check from the U.S. side and say, hey, this is not actually made in the USA? It's at a customs level, I guess, but legal as well.
No, you're absolutely right. So where a seller intends the product to be for export, it doesn't actually matter, because the product may also be purchased by a U.S. purchaser, unless an exporter is, deciding, what, I'm not going to sell to anyone in the United States, which I don't actually know of any seller who comes to that conclusion. And so because of the nature of the internet and its reach to market across the world, including across the United States, any exporter is still bound to these rules, and you want to be sure to pay attention to them.
For example, I know in China you can't say, this is a great toothpaste. You can't use terms that imply that it's great, it's wonderful, let alone functional use, which you certainly can't claim without certain clarifications or certification. Is that something that when you're exporting you should be aware of, not just for China or the income country, but as an outbound?
Yeah, so when something is going outbound, of course, so we've got the US side, and then, yes, you've got those requirements of the other country. And so if you've got a cosmetic, for example, and you're shipping that off to Bahrain, they have their own requirements for goods which are cosmetics. And so on your packaging, you'll need to have something in particular in terms of statements that need to be made, or statements which cannot be made. And how do you find that out, right? Of course, you raise that question. How do you find this information out? Well, probably you'll start with the internet if you're online. And you can look for that, you can look for the equivalent of the U.S. agency. You can reach out to the commercial officer, the commercial attaché at the U.S. Embassy or the U.S. Consulate. See if you can find a contact there. Maybe you start with the U.S. Consulate or Embassy here in the U.S. Try to find a contact there. Maybe you contact your local Export Assistance Center, export.gov. They can then point you to the different Export Assistance Centers. I forget how many. There's 8 or 12 or something across the country.
108.
108? There's 108, so way more than 8.
So, Deanna, you've talked about qualified and unqualified claims, for the most part, right? You've talked about made in the USA, the all or virtual all standard. Conspicuous as to the truth of the good. Could you talk a little about that? And is that from the import perspective?
When we're talking about imports, so imports relate to something that is coming from another country, by definition. So anytime a product is coming in and its packaging has on there, made in USA, it's going to raise a red flag with U.S. Customs, because that's something, from another country cannot be made in USA. So
you're referring to, sorry, Deanna, you're referring to, let's say I have something made in China, and the packaging I also have made in China, and I say, oh, by the way, could you put that made in the USA logo on that?
Correct. Yes, okay. Yes. And so what ends up happening is you've got U.S. Customs who detains your shipment because under the statute itself, so the statute is the law, I think it's 19 U.S.C. 1304, where you must have the country of origin marking on your product. And so because it's coming from China and all the customs information says that, again, you have to pay taxes, the customs duties. And on that document that you file with U.S. Customs, you indicate several different factors about the shipment, including the country of origin. Because remember, some countries we have preferential trade agreements with. And so, if as your business grows, you find that you'd want to send some inputs and go have them further manufactured in another country and then return them to the U.S. for your final manufacturing. You can benefit from going to a country with whom we've got a preferential trade agreement with. In any case, coming back to this idea of something that says it's made in the USA, which is actually imported, when customs then flags it and says to you what's going on, sometimes they ask you to redeliver the goods to them. And sometimes they'll do that 6 months after you've already received the cargoes and potentially even sold them. So now you're going to get a penalty because you can't redeliver them. They also notify the FTC. And so now the FTC conducts its own investigation with respect to your product. So you've got both a customs investigation and now you've also got an FTC investigation. And the customs, understand, they will seize your goods. So they won't even allow them in. If you're lucky, they may allow you to go and change the packaging. So for example, there's something known as a bonded warehouse. And a bonded warehouse is where activities can occur to goods which have come into the United States physically, but are treated as not having entered into the commerce of the United States until such time as entry is made. And so you may be able to go there and repackage or relabel or whatever you may need to do.
So Deanna, I want to talk a little bit about costly considerations for exporting. What's a bonded inventory versus bonded warehouse and some of that stuff?
Sure. Well, the costly considerations has to actually do with when you're exporting and when you are sending goods to a warehouse. So remember I spoke earlier about the example of sending replacement or warranty repair parts to a warehouse in another country so that they can be sent quickly to fulfill the warranty requirements to get your computer fixed, for example. You run into an issue, and this happens a lot with the LATAM countries, Latin America, Central America, really, where a good enters into that country, even though it's still your product. Let's say, for example, you have somebody who's willing to sell your goods at their store. So you send over 50 units, and they want to then try and sell your product. In your mind, you have it remaining as your good, and it's not until it's sold that there's a sale, and then you get your commission, or they get their commission, and you get the remainder of the sale, for example.
So a consignment scenario.
A consignment scenario, yes. Well, for several of those countries, what ends up happening upon an importation to that country, that actual recipient of your imported, or I guess your exported goods, they have to take title and pay customs duties on those. Okay, and so what ends up happening is, in the event let's say only 25 pieces were sold, and so you say, okay, you know what, go ahead and return all of those to me. You're going to be subject now, well, before they'll send it to you, they're going to be asked that they pay taxes because the government is treating it as a sale. So if you want to have those come back to you, the government will treat that for the company, your consignment partner, as a sale upon which they need to pay taxes. And so you run into this currency repatriation issue, even though you hadn't intended that to occur. So again, this is another consideration. All these considerations are meant to protect you from spending more money, wasting time, and just generally being stressed out and questioning yourself and your ability, should I even do this business, or what have I done now? Do some homework in advance. That's really the moral.
So if you can talk about duty drawbacks from the perspective of, you're saying, an importer into the U.S., and then perhaps we can talk about the inverse.
Okay, absolutely. So, in my experience, it's not uncommon that a company will import a large volume of goods with the intention of selling them, wherever they can. And they're selling online. So some of those sales will be here in the U.S. Some of those sales will end up going back out to foreign purchasers. And what customs allows is an ability to recover almost all, it's not 100%, but it's more than 90% of the duties that were paid to customs. Of course, you have to have your paperwork lined up in order to come back and get it, but there's an ability to get your paid duties back. If, however, that's just how you find your business is naturally developing into, you may want to go ahead and simply have your goods come to what's known as a foreign trade zone. It's referred to as FTZs. You'll see this in other countries, those are referred to as free trade zones. A foreign trade zone is not a free trade zone, but it's physically here in the United States, but for customs purposes, it's not treated as if it were, here for commerce, entered into the country for commerce. So you could lease warehouse space there, and for anything that is, and you don't pay any duties on it until you actually bring it into the United States. So if you find, let's say you've got 25% being sold in the U.S., 75% is being sold in other countries, and you're warehousing it in the foreign trade zone, then you simply just have it shipped back out. And, it's not as if it had come into the United States before. Whereas anything that you then go ahead and sell to a U.S. purchaser, you'll need to pay duties at the time of bringing in that portion. And, I can tell you with small businesses, this year, you may be experiencing one thing, but next year you might have a product that really pops. And so you want to keep these considerations in mind as you grow your business.
That's great, Deanna. Yeah, and we talked a little bit about FTZs in that fulfillment and logistics module, and it's extremely advantageous for the right company. From a legal perspective, we have companies, let's say, that are in Canada, and they're producing in Canada, they're shipping to, let's say, buyers in Asia, and their warehouse, let's say, is in the U.S. for fulfillment. So they produce in Canada, they ship it to a U.S. warehouse. They're thinking of putting that in as an FTZ so that the U.S. doesn't charge them import duties and taxes because it's intended for export. Mm-hmm. But see what I mean? So the fulfillment facility is here, and they're not going to create another fulfillment facility for the rest of the world out of Canada. So they're shipping into their centralized fulfillment community here in the U.S. Right now, it's not an FTZ, and the government is charging them for import duties, and they're also there's a potential for them to charge them sales tax as well because the purchasing unit is through an individual kind of consumer website. Mm-hmm. Is there something that, obviously there's what should happen, but if you find yourself in this scenario, how do you legally have recourse to say, hey, no, we shouldn't be charged that?
Right. So the way to have an ability to say that, the easiest way really is to go to customs before you ever engage in the activity and ask them for a decision. So customs has an ability where we can lay out a proposed transaction, so Canada, but foreign sales, but we want to use this U.S. facility. Because again, look, if money is being spent here in the United States, that's a good thing, right? Because we always want to encourage whatever sort of commercial activity, provided it's legal. So what I would recommend is confirm with customs, yes, this type of transaction leads to this result. This way, where a problem comes up with, whomever, with whatever shipment, then you're able to take your decision and say, well, based on this, you told me that this was, permissible.
Formally, because to me, the word customs, it's very amorphous. Whom do I go? Is there like excuse me, customs? How do you get that decision? And again, that's a formal decision. And it means that you're basically getting a pre-decision saying you can't come back to me later and say I owe this.
That's right. Not until they revoke that decision. And in terms of the who does it go to, because you're right, it's a huge agency. And so depending on the issue determines where do we send this to. Generally speaking, they have an Office of Regulations and Rulings. But if we're dealing with an admissibility issue, so if it's about can we even import this product, it's cocoa leaves. Can we import? No, you can't. But, where it's potentially a drug, then, if you want to ask the question.
My head went straight to chocolate.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, no. So, depending on what the thing is or what the issue is, if you are just trying to figure out the country of origin, then you're looking for an origin determination. So depending on are you looking for a classification? So yes, it's a big agency. Who do you go to? Depends on what you want to do.
And that's why lawyers exist.
Well, we're
So,
here to help. You
Deanna
know,
Clark Esposito in the house.
we're here to help.
We'll put your URL right here.
Okay. Thank
Let's
you.
transition to protecting your IP. Could you talk a little about the things that companies can do to protect their IP as an e-commerce company, especially? Most of them do protect themselves in the US, but then they're shipping all over the world.
Well, so, as a general proposition, IP is something that's difficult to protect. And even where a company, and I'll tell you, I think this can be very dangerous for companies, but, where a company obtains protection here in the US and then, invests in having that protection in other countries, um, you still run into issues. And the problem you have with something like a trademark is that you constantly have to defend it. You have to police it, so you need to be looking at other online channels to see if somebody else has copied what you've done. You then have to police it by sending, a cease and desist letter. We saw you doing XYZ. And then there are cases where you can even find them and get them to come to court. Now, in terms of making that investment, when I talk to smaller companies, I know this is a concern for them. And in part because when you type in something on the internet, you've got a deluge of things from trademark attorneys. Oh, you've got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. Well, I say you got to do it to a point. And the reason for that is because if you have a small business, what are you going to do? Spend all of your money on trademark protection when you don't even know if you've got a viable business? I don't recommend that. Get your business up and running. Does anybody even want to buy your product? Does anyone want to even buy your product under that name? Right? You love it. I would love it. That doesn't mean everybody would love it. So, get your business up and running. And in terms of if you then, have an ability, let's say you do get a U.S. trademark, U.S. Customs has its own recordation process. And so once they approve that filing, now they're on the lookout. So if something is coming in, even if your piece is within another device. So if what you're selling goes into a final product that then comes back into the United States and you have your protections on that. Customs is known for opening up products, even circuit boards. We dealt with a case like this just this year. And there were two pieces on the board for which the foreign manufacturer did not have authorization to use that trademarked product. And so it was seized. So Customs offers other protections.
Can you give us a quick kind of estimate? If we're saying, I get the fact that you've got to be up and running and it could paralyze you thinking about trademarking around the world. But people say, oh, well, I'm going to do the US and then I'll do that Madrid Protocol thing. Mm-hmm. That can get expensive.
$30,000. It's very, very expensive.
How much is that?
I said $30,000. Yeah.
Yeah. So, if you're going to choose a couple of countries, well, how do you bring that matrix? You say, look, I got $10,000. I'm going to protect my IP in the U.S. and maybe China. Where else? What do I do?
I would say either stop there or where else are you targeting your sales to? Because if you're, let's use our French example. So if your product is very popular in France, then your numbers are growing in terms of volumes of sale. It means your product's getting more exposure. It means there are more French who may want to piggyback on your success. So depending, look at your volumes in terms of where are the sales. That would be the next approach. The next approach really is to sit down and strategize on where you want to make your next investment.
Let me give you a scenario and you tell me if, no, okay, none of that. Because I have this guy who manufactures in China, their manufacturer patented their product, and now even though they're patented in the U.S., meaning the U.S. company, they can't even manufacture in China anymore for the rest of the market.
Oh, wow.
It's interesting. Anyway.
Yeah, well, again, as I had said before, the reason why we are here to help you is because we want to protect you guys from spending money you don't need to, making poor choices, things that can be detrimental to your business. And certainly I've got plenty of trademark and patent attorneys that I'd be happy to refer anyone to. In fact, I've got a very large network. So if anybody watching has something that they need, you can reach out to my office and we'll try and connect you with an appropriate resource.
Is there any other advice or things that I'm missing that we should be talking about?
Well, I think when I think about e-commerce sellers, because I had a fair amount of experience with hundreds actually, whether working one-on-one with them, whether mentoring them, whether being on a panel for startup competitions. And and I find a couple of things happen, and I want to caution exporters against getting too involved. And we can start with the trademarking and these things, because I notice the idea of something, and then whatever design they come up with to embody the thing that they're selling is very personal to them. And I want to encourage you small business owners to not get too attached to any of what is essentially an asset of the business. At some point, and maybe you don't have an exit plan, but if you have thought of an exit plan, you'll be wanting to look at selling one of those, things, and that trademark can be its own asset. But because it's such a large investment, ease into spending those monies, because you've got other things that you need to be paying attention to.
Okay, so entrepreneurs, they fall in love with their own product. They don't want to let it go.
Well, it's the product, but then it's the logo. It's the design that they come up with, because now they have visualized something that embodies the things that they're selling or their business. It's their baby, instead of well, this is my law. Like, this is I own my own law firm, but I am not my law firm. It's not my baby. We help streamline the global business operations, and it's important for you e-commerce sellers, because I've just heard a lot of sort of the thought process with small sellers. Well, I don't, want to be big. Well, I don't this and that. But a lot of that talk is really, I'm not sure I can get that big, so I'm going to do this self-talk job on myself. But the truth is, you can get big. And with that, at some point, you're going to need to say, okay, this business is getting serious. I need to start paying more attention and making sure that I am following the laws. Because oftentimes getting a trademark is the only type of legal assistance a startup will even get. And then they'll sort of cruise along until they get in trouble. And I want to encourage you small businesses, every 6 months, ask yourself, okay, what can I be dipping my toe in now compliance-wise? Come back and watch this video. Come back and watch the other videos on this platform. Keep educating yourself. Josh, you have a question for me?
Yeah, because I want to make sure I understand. Obviously, yes, we do our trademarks first because we love what we did, and we want to own that and protect that. But what is the next step? When you say compliance-wise, if I make left-handed widgets, like, what should I be looking at doing? What are you referring to specifically? Yeah.
Sure. Well, if you don't know what questions to even ask, and you want some help to even put an outline together, start looking around for a trusted resource. So whether it's somebody who's a consultant, who focuses on exports, maybe to the particular part of the world you're interested in shipping to, or you're finding a lot of success in. Maybe it is with an attorney who maybe focuses not just on exporting, but on certain types of exports. Maybe you're exporting, software, and all of your exports are going out by email, with attachments, for example, as opposed to a physical product. Then look for somebody, who specializes in digital exports.
You're referring to making sure that, for example, what we've been talking about, I'm selling to the right people, I'm not selling to the wrong people, I've got the products in the right places to maximize the opportunity, but also mitigate any legal exposure, those types of questions. You should be constantly having a person or a firm that you can touch base with.
That's right. You want to add this person to be part of your core team, right? So if you're wearing all of the hats of your firm, of your company, and this is simply a hat you cannot wear, then put this in your top 3 other people you need. For example, you need an accountant, or you need a bookkeeper because you can't manage your QuickBooks anymore, and it's not talking correctly with your e-commerce platform. Time to bring in a bookkeeper. And that, if you don't have one already, go get one. But there's certain top professionals you want to include on your team to help protect you and save you money.
That's great. That's very helpful, and especially as you go, I presume there are people, not necessarily retainers, but you can just call them and say, okay, for an hour, I need another consultation. Or how does that process work? Or for smaller companies, and what's a scenario from a legal perspective that you could set up?
Mm-hmm. So generally, when we get calls that come in like that, we do have a formal consultation process. We have a fee, it's $300, where you retain the firm within 3 business days. We take that off of your first invoice. And what we do during the consultation is, after we gather the information about what you're trying to accomplish, short term, near, long term, etc., then we can come up Either there may be an obvious next step, especially if it sounds like you're in trouble. So we may simply provide an evaluation. Oftentimes what we'll do as a first service is we just do a report. It's a flat fee. We do a report and we go ahead and identify for you where we see the risks, and we talk about next steps, and we wrap that up with a follow-up call a few days after you've had a chance to receive the report. Because we find companies, especially if they're coming to an attorney for the first time, aside from their trademark attorney, they don't actually know what kinds of questions to be asking. They don't know what sorts of risks are involved with their business and to what extent it can even maybe put them out of business. So we try and help bring some clarity around that for them.
Let's talk a little about distributors and the legal engagement with distributors around the world. Particularly a distributor that's selling products that either you haven't authorized or a price point that you haven't authorized, or they're taking products. Let's say in the worst case scenario, I've had companies come to me and they say, my distributor has licensed my product out from under me, or my distributor is using the packaging from the original order, but they're actually swapped. Now that they're empty, they're collecting the empty cartridges. Let's say if it's an aftermarket auto, and they're taking oil from their brother's uncle and they're putting it in. Which brother's uncle would actually be your uncle? But let's get into that another day.
Okay. Yeah, well, you know what? I've had these questions presented, here at the firm as well. And our first question is, well, what does your agreement with them say? And oftentimes the answer is, oh, we didn't have an agreement. Okay, well, how did you know what to do, or how did they know what to do? Oh, well, we, had a series of emails that, okay, all right. Well, now we do have something in writing that sets out what at least what you thought were the terms would be. And how long have you been doing this for in this way? So now we're coming down to, well, what has the course of dealings been with your interactions? Because where you don't have a contract, our fallback is what the law is. Where you have a contract, now you actually have terms that you both agreed to. There was a so-called meeting of the minds, and that would govern. And if you had done so and put this in, you may have a clause in relation to where any disputes would be actually heard. So perhaps, New York, for example.
That's a good point. One of the key questions I was going to ask you. Sorry, Deanna, don't want to cut you off.
It's okay.
No. So a lot of that first paragraph of the dealings in your contract, if a company is in Italy, the distributor, and they say, great, the legal proceedings will take place in Italy, you should always, I presume, push to have the legal proceedings be based in your location where your or company's registered?
Absolutely, because that's the cheapest and easiest way. Where you allow the jurisdiction to remain in Italy, that means if you want to begin a case, you've got to find Italian attorneys. Then you need to figure out how to actually start a case, which they'll figure out for you, but it's going to cost you quite a bit of money. Whereas if you're able to say, okay, I'm in Orange County, I have this problem, who's in Orange County, or do I already know a lawyer who can refer me an attorney in LA, Orange County, etc., and then you just go from there. Of course, anytime you're dealing with any sort of foreign jurisdiction, there's several questions that come up. Will they even respond? Is that country part of, let's say we've got an arbitration case, there's something called the New York Convention. So different countries recognize that they will acknowledge and enforce arbitral awards. So that's where after an arbitration, you have your award and you want to go get the money, for example. But is this country even part of it? The long and the short of this entire video really is simply that with exports, there's a lot of opportunities and there's a lot of risks. Of course, in terms of sales and revenue, and really the sky's the limit. But depending on where you're going to, and some people are, you like risk, right? Some people are just like that. Let's roll the dice on this one and deal with it when we get caught. A lot of people do have that mindset, let's not ask, let's just wait until we get caught. The problem is getting caught under any number of scenarios can actually put you out of business. So, once you get your business up and running, maybe you're 18 months, 24, 30, whatever your comfort level is, but really start looking at who else do you need to put on your core team to start protecting the business. Because if you're a few years in, maybe your revenues, you're between, you've gotten to at least $500,000, you're feeling pretty confident, and you don't want it to crumble. You want to keep running the business, or now you're thinking, you know what, I could sell this, start up another business with that money, and do it all over again. But you're able to just think differently when you've got more resources. And we've seen clients grow, and of course, as you grow, you want to try new ventures. You bring on more risk. So we're here to help protect you and save you money.
Thank you. And when you talk about the structure, is it important to create, if your product line, you were talking about that earlier, the product lines should be registered as maybe separate companies or separate entities under our company so that you can spin them off and keep the mother company, or is there a structure that you suggest?
Well, it depends on what the owners want to do. So, for example, we could talk about setting up a so-and-so holdings company, right? And then under that, you've got this product line, that product line, that product line. And maybe something is governed by FDA, like a cosmetic or tobacco product. Okay, but that's our only regulated product. And then these other companies are dealing in unregulated goods, and they're much easier. When the time comes, yes, you can sell just the one business. But even looking at the business, how do we want to set different things up within the business so that we can capitalize the most on the sale? But let's face it, a lot of startup e-commerce sellers, they're not thinking about the exit plan and what they want to do. They want to see if this idea even works. And understand, you can set up your business one way, get it up and running, and then you can create the holdings company and have the holdings company acquire your company. So there's all kinds of ways that these things can be set up. It's never too late to change something. It may be too late in the sense that it won't make sense to because of whatever reason, but in terms of actually making a change, unless the government's given a specific license to your company for a specific export, for example. I mean, there are reasons why it could be more complicated. But again, and SBA has the SCORE office. I know that they have counselors. It's a group of retired business people. And,
Sure.
You may want to reach out to them to see if they can help you make sense of, okay, who should I have on my team? And they'll have those meetings with you. It's a free resource, offered by Small Business Administration.
Deanna Clark Esposito coming to us from New York. Deanna, thanks so much for downloading all that knowledge, and we look forward to keeping in touch.
Thanks for having me. Anytime.
Okay, that was amazing. We talked to Diana Clark Esposito, an import-export lawyer on the cutting edge of all things e-commerce. We talked about marketing and the legal considerations as it pertains to overseas online, such as qualified and unqualified claims. We talked about OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, because essentially, even if you're selling to individuals in an overseas market, you still need to abide by those regulations. What does that mean? At the point of checkout, here's an action item for you. You can put an option so that if a consumer, let's say in France, is going to resend that to somebody in another country that's on the consolidated screening list, you've got to make sure that you've asked the right question. Now, that doesn't absolve you of all liability, but it is a mitigating circumstance if you end up getting called upon a court of law. So these are some issues, but again, consult a lawyer. More so, Diana Clark Esposito coming to it in the house, in the van. We'll see you soon.